Chapter 3. A uniformed armed security officer stood inside each of the two soundproof doors, augmenting the guards on the corridor side. On the floor of a small amphitheater, a small lectern stood, flanked by Beck and Patricia on one side, Jack Clemente and Dr. Tabbert on the other. Their expressions were uniformly blank. The lecture hall, although the smallest at the Institute, was still 2/3 empty. The 20 orderlies, nurses, psychiatric social workers, and technicians slowly filled seats in the first 3 rows. After 3 minutes of nervous buzz and rustling, the room grew quiet as Tabbert approached the podium. "Good morning, colleagues." He spread his notes across the podium. He didn't need them, wouldn't be there long enough to use them, but he always spread notes before speaking. "You have each been selected for this," he seemed to be looking for a word, "appointment on the base of your record, qualifications, and accomplishments. You are all to be congratulated." In the audience, some opened notebooks. Others checked that their pens worked or kicked off their shoes. Few paid attention. They knew from past experiences that this was just a warm-up. The main show would begin only after Tabbert left. "We at the Volcker Institute have a long-honored tradition," Tabbert continued, "of being the first to blaze new frontiers in the ever-widening expanses of neuropsychiatric explorations. Today, we begin the journey anew." Patricia, twice-bleached lab coat covering the ankle-length utilitarian dress she'd particularly chosen for this morning, checked her notes, then sneaked a look at Beck. His jaw was tight. Eyes staring straight ahead. Had she not known any better, she'd have assumed he was the one about to undergo therapy. "I am satisfied," Tabbert droned on, "that all of you will function in the highest traditions of the Institute, that all of you will give the difficult task ahead your best efforts, that all of you will do nothing to bring dishonor on those of us not privileged to be part of this noble effort." He gathered his notes, bowed at Clemente and Beck, noticeably ignoring Patricia, then turned and walked briskly from the room. Jack waited for the guard to close the door behind the chief of staff before walking over to the podium. He smiled out at the audience. "Good morning." They all came to attention, pens poised over pads. He leaned casually against the lectern. "A couple of ground rules to start. This project is classified at the highest levels. Since all of you here have worked under similar security before, I won't bother to go over each of the rules individually. You've all received copies of them. Read them. One thing more. All discussions of this project, even with other project personnel, must take place only within the project's confines itself, that is, within the walls of Unit A-249. Security insists on this." He took a deep breath, looking over the group. "Somebody once said always open with a joke." "Okay," he paused. "Now, what do you get when you take a type A3 personality, thoroughly train him in the rather arcane arts of deep penetration intelligence work, then subject him to over 6 years of solitary confinement in one of the harshest penal environments in the world?" A long silence. No answers, no guesses. Jack nodded slowly. "Precisely our problem. Our task here is threefold. First, answer the question I've just propounded. Second, find a way to do whatever psychic damage his captivity did to him. Third, and this is the hard one, folks, return the subject to as close an approximation of normalcy as possible." "Define normalcy," a voice from the audience called out as the others wrote furiously. Jack thought about that for a moment. That's a valid question. Suppose you're standing in line for the movies on a cold day. Suddenly, a man cuts in front of you, getting the last available seat. You're forced to remain out in the cold for another 2 hours. A normal person would protest. A type A1 would protest, perhaps loud enough to call the manager. Our subject, suffering from a decomposition of his personality, with occasional reversions to primitive behavior, would most likely attack and kill the interloper, and possibly the usher that allowed him in. He paused. I'll settle for the type A1 response as normal in this case. He turned and nodded at Patricia. She stood, took a deep breath as she walked to the podium, and began without pause. Our course of treatment is unclear at this point, she said, in a strong voice. But if we can rely on the record, 4 points are manifestly clear. She opened a file. 1. We must limit access to the subject, particularly during the early stages of treatment, until we are convinced that his sudden mood changes and violent lapses are under control. Only Dr. Clemente, myself, and one nurse and orderly per shift will be allowed in actual contact with him. 2. Due to the subject's very high intelligence, we must constantly question whether his demeanor and actions are true reflections of his actual emotional state or merely sophisticated masks put into place to lure us into a false sense of security. You must never let your guard down around this man. 3. A preliminary diagnosis of decomposition lability syndrome has been arrived at. Since this is a relatively rare condition, I expect you all to read up on it, but let me give you this critical reminder. Never good at public speaking, she picked a spot in the back of the room, directing her comments at a Chagall print. Although we have drastically reduced the stress that the subject is under, the erosion of his personality will continue as long as he remains under some form of close custody, no matter how lenient that custody is or is perceived. Go the extra mile. Smile, laugh at his jokes if there are any, give him maximum encouragement constantly, but be prepared for sudden rejection or violent reaction to the most trivial of things. A hand was raised in the second row. Dr. Newman, a nurse, said quietly, just how violent is the subject? How much risk are we in? Patricia looked over at Jack. We'll deal with that issue in due course, she said crisply. Patricia slightly raised her eyebrows, then turned back to the audience. 4th, most important and apropos your question, never under any circumstances confront the patient over anything. Never paint him into a corner or limit his options. She took a deep breath. Over and above his aberrant behavior reflexes and phased atavism, he has been trained, she looked down at Beck, to the finest edge to respond to confrontation with overwhelming force and violence. She paused as if unsure where to go at that point. Finally, she turned to Beck. Before I conclude, she said softly, it might well serve us to get the subject's history at this point. She stepped aside as Beck took the podium. My name, he said in a steady voice, is Brigadier General Alexander Beck, formerly SACSA to the Joint Chiefs. What? Several people in the audience said at once. Beck smiled. My apologies. The Special Assistant to the Chief of Staff for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities. 12 years ago, I was tasked with creating a unit of special deep penetration intelligence agents capable of operating and surviving in a hostile, urban, or unpopulated environment without the need for support or instructions. He leaned casually against the lectern. Simply put, take a man or woman, give them a task like, severely curtail Soviet agricultural output in the Ukraine or retard Chinese nuclear facility manufacture, then turn them loose. They would have the training, ability, and survivability to go out, do their jobs for a set amount of time, then be extracted, say, 6 months later. He smiled a private smile. It was the perfect concept. Completely self-sufficient, they would blend with the targeted communities, take whatever they needed to live, and carry out their missions from the targeted populace themselves. Low maintenance, high yield, covert, effective human rifles, just point and shoot. The audience was stilled. A study from the Horizon Institute in Santa Monica suggested for the types of operations we were contemplating, We seek out sociopathic personalities. It was felt that given their lack of a traditional moral base, as well as their ability to carry out complex, high-risk tasks without emotional judgments as to the relative rightness of those tasks, they would make the perfect tools. Jesus, someone muttered. Beck fixed him with a withering stare. Unfortunately, sir, as it turned out, he paused for a long time. I wasn't. As the project briefing continued, a briefing of another kind was taking place inside Unit A-249. On the edge of the grounds, the small, solitary building looked from the outside like a large, typically German hunting lodge. Surrounded by the Institute's vast lawn, less than 100 meters from the woods, there were precisely laid out beds of color-coordinated flowers, compacted dirt paths, and carefully controlled ivy vines creeping up the sides of the building. The windows were tinted, preventing anyone from looking in, and the doors were always locked. Inside, the pastoral setting was quickly forgotten. The ground floor, with its stark hospital white walls, utilitarian carpet, and lack of decoration, always came as a shock to any of the uninitiated upon first entering. Then, when passed through the double electronically controlled doors, the visitor would be further surprised by the presence of a full nursing station. It was as if one were on the intensive care ward of any modern hospital, with one exception. There were no patient rooms anywhere in sight. There was a fully manned high-tech security room that featured monitors revealing every inch of the surrounding grounds. There was a fully stocked pharmacy, including the newest, most experimental drugs. There was a room just off the nurse's station that contained a bank of monitors and sound equipment that eavesdropped on what appeared to be patient rooms, but exactly where those rooms were was unclear. The second floor of the lodge/unit was the decompression chamber. Designed to be comfortable as well as functional, this floor contained a completely stocked kitchen, dining room, and 2 dormitory-like bedrooms, each capable of sleeping 5. Across from this living area were the office suites, 6 offices grouped around 2 secretary stations. They were linked to the Institute's main computers as well as the internet. When fully staffed, there were no functions that could be done in the main building that could not be duplicated here. There was also a second security office between the 2 suites, but there was still no sign of patient rooms. Deep below the building, at a depth of 10 meters, about 3 stories down, surrounded by 2-foot-thick reinforced concrete walls, the patient rooms are found. An elevator, its disguised doors behind the nurse's station on the ground floor, and in the security office on the second floor, ran noiselessly among the 3 floors. Controlled by only 3 keys, it led directly to an antechamber outside the patient suite. The chamber was small, 3 meters square. Its only features a television monitor that displayed the interior of the suite and an intercom. Then there was the door. Steel reinforced, barred, deadbolted, and key-locked, it required 2 keys to open, as well as a switch being thrown in the upstairs security office. The suite itself was comfortable, 5 meters square with a 2.5-meter ceiling. The main living area had a spacious feel to it, very much like the suite in a 5-star hotel it had been modeled after, with several notable exceptions. All the furniture was bolted to the floor with pneumatic torque wrenches. The painting, silverized plastic mirrors, and the air duct grills were similarly secured. The books in the living room's bookcase were all paperbacks or soft covers, none weighing more than 2 pounds. All clothes were stored in drawers that could not be removed from their bureaus. Even the carpeting was specially secured and fire-resistant, overkill since there was no way to produce a flame anywhere in the suite. Yet despite it all, it was comfortable, even luxurious by any standards. So much so that it had become the favorite trysting place for the junior staff during the many months of the year that the unit lay deserted and unused. But thoughts of fervent lovers, sneaking moments of passion in this underground, polished, and pampered dungeon were far from Conrad Edel's mind. As head of the Institute's elaborate security force and elder of his church, he was torn by the dichotomy of the job ahead. He'd read the file, at least that part of it he'd been given, on Newman, and he agreed in principle with the decision to house him in this most maximum of maximum security units. The man's potential for mayhem was truly frightening, but he also felt that there was something very wrong with it. A veteran of Germany's Grenzschutzgruppe 9, he'd been on the front line of his country's battle against terrorism and communism. He'd fought, been wounded, seen beloved comrades die, most needlessly in his opinion. He understood what the pressures and stresses of constant combat could do to a man. He'd seen many snap under a tenth of the pressure this Newman had been subjected to. And yet, if the file was to be believed, Newman hadn't snapped, far from it. He had done his job, completed every task assigned him, then, once in the hands of the bastard Russians, he had kept faith, revealed nothing, made their lives miserable, forced them to use inordinate resources to guard him, even escaped twice. Edel thought about it constantly since Dr. Tabbert had given him this assignment. If lives were taken by Newman in the process, then the bastard Russian files might well be lies, to besmirch a genuine hero of the West. Then, to Edel's mind, it was merely a soldier doing his duty, the fortunes of war. And for those sacrifices, Newman was to be figuratively, almost literally, buried alive. Prodded and pushed by the head shrinkers who had never risked anything, who vilified men like Newman and Edel, men who had stood on walls for countless generations, protecting those who would not lay it on the line and their right to not take the risks. But Edel was, at heart, a product of the German military. He didn't know how not to follow orders. He turned to his men as they emerged from their tour of the unit, making a mental note to say a special prayer at this Wednesday's Bible study for Brian Newman. Come to attention. The former soldiers and cops that made up one of the highest paid private security forces in Germany snapped too. Edel slowly walked up and down the row of security men, adjusting a man's button here, ordering a haircut to another. Finally, he returned to the front of the formation. Gentlemen, we are expected to have all personnel and protocols in place as of 1400 today. The patient will be transferred at 1500. Condition 1 security will be observed throughout the transfer. I have some personal orders for you prior to those events. He paused, his expression a mixture of severity and pathos. You will remain at least 3 meters from the patient as you have been instructed. You will remain constantly vigilant for any furtive movement from the patient as instructed. You will take whatever actions you deem appropriate to protect your life and the lives of others if the patient attempts to flee or attacks anyone, as instructed. He held up a finger. When he spoke, his voice was choked with emotion. However, you will maintain and demonstrate respect for the man at all times. You will address him as sir. You will, when there is no conflict with your orders, endeavor to make his confinement as, he struggled for the word, livable as possible. Always remember that he is a comrade in arms whose glorious service must be exalted, even as we must confine him. He continued sadly for his own benefit. He straightened. Remember the words of our beloved Savior, and should you not have compassion on your fellow servant as I have had on you? Dismiss. Looking across the lawn at the men assembled in front of the unit, Patricia hoped that they would remember that this was a hospital, not a prison camp. Although Edel had conceded that he wouldn't use guard dogs, due primarily to the continuing German sensitivity to the image of armed, uniformed men shepherding vicious dogs, Patricia turned back to the briefing as Dr. Clemente was finishing up. In essence, Jack was saying as he reviewed the medical chart he had just gone over, we are talking about a man who has been alone since shortly after birth. Raised by a succession of foster families, he consistently received high grades despite being classified as a discipline problem. Graduating in the top 8th of his class, he turned down several academic scholarships, disappearing for 2 years until he enlisted in the Army. Considered an exemplary recruit with extremely high leadership qualities, he was recommended for officer candidate school. Shortly thereafter, he was court-martialed for crippling a drill instructor who he believed was being unfair to him. Prior to trial, he was recruited for the Deep Penetration Project. He paused and looked up from his notes. It is my personal opinion that the initial recruitment diagnosis was premature. However, the possibility cannot be discounted. He picked up a single sheet of paper. The results of his Menninger-Coleman-Forsman personality inventory are strikingly similar to that of a sociopath. He began to read from the paper. He manifests an inability to understand ethical values except on a verbal level. There exists a marked discrepancy between his intelligence and his conscience development. He is egocentrically impulsive. He has shown an inability to learn from previous mistakes, except, he looked up, and this exception is striking in and of itself, except by learning to exploit people and to escape punishment. He returned to the report. He is hedonistic, living in the present without thought to past or future. He is charming, likable, with a disarming manner, and a clear ability to win the liking and friendship of others. He is, beneath that facade, cynical, unsympathetic, ungrateful, and remorseless in his dealing with others. He has a quick ability to rationalize his behaviors, often cloaking them in favorable light, such as patriotic duty. And needless to say, he has a most vivid imagination. He took a long drink of water, gathering his thoughts before continuing. But I must remind you in closing that his mere act of enlisting in the military, of joining the deep penetration program, seems, at least superficially, to fly in the face of that diagnosis. He closed the file and looked out across them. Therefore, assume nothing when dealing with him. Observe, report, theorize, take no chances, but ignore no possible area of inquiry. Always remember that whether or not the subject is sociopathic, he is unquestionably deeply disturbed. The conditions of his incarceration would account for that at the very least. He paused. Questions? A young psychiatric social worker raised his hand. Couldn't his enlistment and then later volunteering merely have been his ways to escape presumed punishment? Certainly when he was facing a court-martial. Jack nodded yes, but it must be remembered that after he was released on his first assignment, he had plenty of opportunities to escape, yet he continually returned after completing those assignments admirably. He paused, an act inconsistent with sociopathy. An older nurse, any history of violence prior to his enlistment? Beck stood up. Childhood fistfights, teenage exploits with the car. At 15, an arrest for drunk and disorderly involving an altercation with an usher at a ball game, but nothing marked until the incident with the drill instructor. A psychologist, any abnormalities in either his CAT scan or MRI? Jack shook his head. His brain appears as normal as mine. That's truly frightening, an unidentified voice from the audience said amid light laughter. A psychiatric resident. What kind of drug regime are you anticipating? From her perch by the window, Patricia chimed in, hopefully none, at least at the outset. She walked over to the lectern. It'll be a hell of a lot easier to diagnose and treat him if he's not half zonked all the time. She paused. If we have to, we'll trank him on an incident-by-incident basis, otherwise nothing. She sat down. Besides, the Russians noted a distinct tolerance to most light and middle-level tranks. According to their files, an elderly neurologist said under his breath. Speaking of which, the psychiatrist in the first row noted, they are remarkably vague as to the details of what he was doing at the time of his arrest. Beck looked over at her. Your question? It might be of help to know what exactly his assignment was and how well he accomplished it. Beck hesitated, clearly pondering some deep conflict. It was strategic in nature, he said after a time. Can you be more specific? The woman pressed. I can, but at this time I won't. Suffice it to say that his mission involved slowing the Soviet industrial base to create shortages of durable and factory-produced goods. Said shortages hopefully leading to civic unrest and pressure on the communist infrastructure. How does one man do that? Someone else asked. Hypothetically, Beck's gaze was fixed, firm, resolute. Okay. In theory, a sufficient disruption in the power grid of a highly industrialized province such as Abkhaz, where most heavy industries' spare parts were manufactured, would create an industrial chain reaction leading to the desired effect. He paused. With the power grid offline for a sufficiently long period of time, the supply of spare parts across the Soviet Union would, in theory, dwindle to the point of causing a near-complete industrial shutdown. Throughout, his voice remained calm, almost professorial. The entire audience stopped and looked up at Beck. There was something in the man's manner that suggested that his hypothetical example had far more substance than indicated. Abkhaz, an MD said in a far-off way. He pulled himself back from his thoughts to the problems at hand. Whatever. Concerning the Russian notation about drug tolerances, his voice trailed off as he seemed momentarily distracted. Abkhaz, his voice was soft and distant. Wasn't that where the Russian reactor blew up? A nervous buzz went through the room. Yeah, someone said a feeder reactor. It spread radiation over half of Eastern and Central Europe, not to mention Central Asia. Killed a few thousand people. When was that? Someone else asked. Beck's expression never changed. It was a graphite, not a feeder reactor, responsible for 93% of the power requirements of Abkhaz. A long pause, and it was approximately 6.5 years ago. The room was immediately silenced, all eyes borne on Beck, whose firm jaw was set and unrevealing. Getting back to the earlier question, he said despite the stares, Mr. Newman fully accomplished his mission in all respects prior to being taken into custody. The silence persisted until a very dramatic neurologist held up his hand. General Beck, sir. Yes. No disrespect intended, sir, but there have been certain questions raised about the information we've been provided with. Beck locked eyes with the doctor, who appeared to be in his 70s, and the doctor continued in an almost gentle voice. As I say, General, I mean no disrespect, but you are the only one in this room who knows the subject, who has known him for a period of time. Now we all, he stopped and looked around the room, at least those of us who have had the misfortune to deal with the former Soviet establishment in the past, we know that often they have fabricated information against an individual suspected of espionage. You, sir, have reviewed the file, and you, sir, know the man. He paused as if trying to figure out how best to phrase his next question. I have no wish to compromise NATO security in any way, sir, but... Beck half nodded at him. Go ahead. The doctor nodded. Okay. Thank you. The file indicates several escape attempts from the penal colony, as well as a series of attacks on the guards therein, as well as a string of fatalities of Soviet military and civilian authority personnel. Even more troubling, an apparent unprovoked attack on a civilian family, resulting in their deaths. He paused. General, can you shed any light on the veracity or prevarication of these accounts? This time, even Clemente and Patricia turned and stared at Beck. He was quiet for a long time, sipping from a glass of water, head down, deep in thought. Doctor, he began with his head down. Kapf, the old man said pleasantly. Dr. Kapf, the Uniform Code of Military Conduct says that a soldier's first duty upon being captured is to attempt to escape. Failing that, he is to force the enemy to commit unusual amounts of men and material to maintain him in custody. He continued, looking down as he spoke. While I cannot vouchsafe the contents of the files that were turned over to us, I can make certain safe assumptions. Mr. Newman was trained to, and by nature was inclined to, do everything in his power to harass his captors. He was among the best we ever trained. A short pause. When he spoke again, it was as if he was talking to himself. His personal resources and instinctive ingenuity are nothing short of frightening. He raised his voice to normal level, looking up at the doctor. Did he attempt to escape on at least 2 occasions? It seems reasonable. Did he inflict the maximum harm possible to his captors in those attempts? I would have. Was there a series of attacks on his guards during his captivity? Probably. A sadness seemed to float slowly down his face. A furrow of his forehead, a look in his eyes, a firming of the lips. Did he, during one of those escape attempts, attack and kill an innocent family of 4? He paused, the sadness seeming to grow within him. I just don't know. He turned and started for the door. Something made him stop halfway there and turn around to face the somber audience, but he is capable of it. Beck left the hall without turning back. He moved quickly through the corridors, turning left, then right, moving randomly through the sprawling complex, not caring about where he was or where he'd end up, just knowing that he had to get out of there. After 5 minutes, he found himself at a door that led out to the rear lawn. There was work to do, he reminded himself. People that had to be briefed, procedures to be planned, systems to inspect. Then there were the countless things that were piling up from his command back in the States. The things he guaranteed the chairman of the Joint He guaranteed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs wouldn't suffer by his absence, but they all had to wait. The priority of the moment was air. He stumbled through the door onto the lawn. About 50 meters from the main building, he stopped and loosened his tie, unbuttoning the collar with the same hand. 5 deep, cleansing breaths later, leaning against a tree, he had pulled it all back together, for the moment at least. The claustrophobia attacks were starting to come more often, less predictably. No, that was a lie. They were as predictable as a Swiss watch or a Yosemite geyser, and they were getting worse. He was 53 years old, a 1-star general with no chance at another one. That was another lie, more exactly a rationalization for the attacks. He would get another promotion, and probably another one after that. Hell, the corporation always rewarded success, and gosh knew how successful he had been. But the attacks would continue. 15 people, 9 men, 6 women, recruited, trained, deployed. 15 people sent as biological guided missiles against enemies real and perceived. 15 people 12 years ago, 6 remaining today. 4 had died in the line, sacrificing themselves to God and country. At least he hoped they saw it that way. But the other 5, they were the ones he saw in his sleep, that pressed him in his waking hours, that stood so close to him they cut off his air, forced him into wide open spaces. Tony and Joab's suicides after killing their wives and children had been the first to collapse from whatever internal thing drove them. Monica had gone ballistic when a man cut her off in traffic. After crashing through 3 cars to get to him, she'd slammed into his car 5 times before eluding the police. But Beck found her, just as he'd found Chris, who'd been systematically blowing up the billboards that obstructed his apartment's view of the mountains, and Colleen, who had found God, then shot to death the televangelist who betrayed her devotion and stolen her money. He could see them all, feel their hands in his, smell the fragrances of the women, the sweat of the men, see the look in their eyes as he blew their brains out. And in that moment, the faces of the other 6, Newman included, the ones still in the field, still practicing their pestilential skills in almost every corner of the world, would come to him. And he knew he had to help them, somehow find a way to let them live their lives under control as normal individuals. Find the peace that their years of service had so completely earned them. He had to help them find that peace, or, out of his love for them, for what they might have been without him, for what they were because of him, out of his personal guilt and rage, he must kill them. Because in the end, he believed that was a more humane act than leaving them to crash and burn as they inevitably must. With Newman, he believed he finally had his chance. He turned, looking at the upper floors of the main building. Alexander Beck was a soldier, and he'd killed many times, personally in Vietnam and the Persian Gulf, as well as by agent. 650 dead in the explosion and subsequent fire along the Trans-Siberian oil pipeline. 1,100 dead after the collapse of missile shelter tunnel construction in Iraq. 1,632 dead after the destruction of a hydroelectric dam in Hunan, China. Over 3,000 dead, perhaps 100,000 injured, untold thousands suffering long-term effects after the destruction of the graphite reactor at Abkhaz. All of them dead, not by his hand, true, but by his orders, sure enough. Stalin had once said, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of thousands merely a statistic. Beck thought that was about right. He would lose no sleep, have no panic attacks over the deaths he had ordered in the name of democracy. But each of those 6, he knew he would carry the looks in their eyes at the moment he would have to shoot them for the rest of his life. He only prayed if it came to that his would be a short life. He buttoned his collar, fixed his tie, and headed back into the main building, trying to ignore the unblinking eyes that he felt sure stared down at him from the 5th floor. 10 minutes later, cold water having been thrown on his face, hair neatly combed, Beck stepped out of an elevator on the 5th floor. Showing his ID at each of the 4 checkpoints, he made his way to the holding area. The guards outside the room snapped to attention at his approach. Beck nodded as he walked past them to the security monitor. He bent down and studied the scene. Newman was sitting on a bed, casually flipping through a magazine. Dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, he looked healthier than at the exchange 3 days earlier. He'd already put on 5 pounds, lost the limp he had manifested after being unchained, and appeared to be adapting well. But Beck knew him too well just to accept appearances. He pressed the intercom. "Brian, it's Alex. Can I come in?" Newman looked up from his newspaper. "Can I stop you?" "Yes, with the word." "Come ahead." He turned a page in the magazine. Beck hesitated. "Will you guarantee my safety?" A spasmodic smile played across the prisoner's lips. "Come ahead and find out." Beck walked over to the door, signaling the guards as he came. They pulled their sidearms, thumbed back the hammers, and watched as Beck unbolted the door. He stepped through, and one of the guards slammed it shut behind him. Newman still didn't look up. "Well," he said flatly, "I'll give you that. You haven't lost your balls." Beck stood absolutely still. "I want to talk to you." For the first time, Newman looked up. "Really? I'm honored." "May I sit down?" Newman shrugged. "It's your padded cell." He returned to his reading as Beck sat on a bed across from Newman. "How are you feeling?" Newman shook his head and clucked his tongue. "Wrong approach. Try again." "Do you need anything?" Small droplets of sweat appeared on Beck's temples. Newman shook his head. "Isn't that what I'm supposed to ask you?" He paused, putting the magazine aside and looking fully at Beck for the first time. "What are we playing here, General?" Beck smiled. "I just want to look in on you, make sure an old friend was being well looked after." Newman silently studied the older man for long minutes. Finally, satisfied at some psychic calculation, he nodded. "So that's it." "What?" Newman smiled, a warm, sincere smile. "Exactly how many of us are left, General?" "You used to call me Alex." "I remember, General. How many?" Beck shrugged. "That's classified." Newman nodded. 10, 5. He paused. "Goodness, if you'll forgive my taking your name in vain, don't tell me I'm the last." Beck looked around the small padded room. "No," he said softly, "you're not the last." The answer seemed to satisfy Newman. He returned to his magazine. "Got a lot to catch up on. I must say I approve of the direction skirt lengths are going." They sat together in total silence for the next half hour, Newman reading, Beck watching him read. "We tried to get you out," Beck said softly. Newman nodded in mock seriousness. "I'm sure you did. These things take time. 6 years, 7 months, 12 days to be exact. 57,972 hours to be more exact. Just under 3.5 million minutes. I know, I counted each one of them." He looked up. "Not exact enough? I can give you the seconds if you like." He paused. "No? Whatever. You like exactness, as I recall, although it has been a long time." He returned to his magazine. "We never stopped trying." "I'm sorry," Newman said in a businesslike voice. "We're fresh out." Beck looked puzzled. "Excuse me?" Newman's voice dropped low and serious. "Odd words coming from you." A pause, and the business voice returned. "As I said, we're fresh out. Try again next week." Newman stood and walked to the double-paned, iron mesh-covered window. Beck stood up, his face a torrent of confusion. "What are you talking about?" Newman continued staring at the window. When he spoke, his voice was barely discernible. "Absolution." Beck stared at the man's back for a full minute before turning and pounding on the door. He heard the bolt thrown, but hesitated pushing it open. "You're being transferred to a more comfortable quarters this afternoon," Beck said in a defeated voice. "Please don't hurt anyone." "Alex?" Newman turned to face Beck. "Yes?" Beck turned toward him as the door opened. Newman took a step forward, causing the guards to take closer aim. "For you, this once." Beck nodded and walked out of the cell. The door was slammed behind him. He spent the rest of the day and well into the evening sitting in the middle of the lawn, staring at the trees and trying to breathe.